I spent a lot of my childhood home alone. My mum was a single parent for most of my early years. My dad had left for work one day when I was less than a year old and never came home. Mum juggled two jobs and was out almost all the time. The childcare is so expensive in my town that it wouldn't have been worth her going to work, so she just left me on my own. One night, my mum was scheduled for a night shift at this warehouse she worked at, and it was a Friday night. I'd invited my friend Rebecca over to hang out. We watched a couple of movies, but her parents insisted she be home before dark, so she left at about 8 p.m. It was dark by 8:30. I continued watching TV alone in my upstairs bedroom, which had a window facing the backyard. It was all grown-up shows at this time of night on TV. I didn't really like them, but they were better than nothing. Suddenly, the sound of scraping metal caught my attention. I glanced out the window and saw someone sitting on a deck chair in the garden below. Instinctively, I called out Rebecca's name, assuming she had returned. But the figure that looked up wasn't her. Panic surged through me as I realized this was a stranger lurking in the darkness. A lot of my friends lived nearby, so I texted them asking if it was them, but they all said no. It didn't really make sense looking back, but I think I was just scared to face the reality of the situation. My heart pounding, I cautiously approached the window again. The intruder was still there, staring up at me. He was a man, and it was clear that he had seen me. I jumped back from the window. My mind was racing. Why was he there? What was he going to do? Huddled on my bed, I waited in darkness. I didn't even dare to turn on my phone's screen or make any noise. I wanted him to think I'd left the room. Minutes passed, and I eventually mustered the courage to check again. My stomach dropped when I saw him still down there, fixated on my window. I thought about texting my mum, but the warehouse made them switch their phones off on shift, so she wouldn't get my message until later anyway. And by that time, I figured I could be dead. I decided to confront him, hoping it would scare him off. I opened my window and shouted down, "What do you want?" Then his shoulders started shaking as if he was laughing uncontrollably. But there was no sound, no proper sound, just a strange, whistling kind of sound. It was eerie, and I asked him to leave before retreating from my window. Back in bed, I hesitated to call the police. I knew it was the right thing to do, but it felt like such a big deal doing it for the first time. I left my room and quietly sat at the top of the stairway, listening. I heard the back door being pushed and the handle turning as he tried to get in. I was terrified and dashed back to my room. I was only 12 and I didn't know what to do. I heard him move to the front door and try to force that one open. It wouldn't budge and he gave up quickly, thank God. I locked my bedroom window and closed the curtains. If our doors hadn't been locked, things could have taken a much darker turn. I was a skinny, weak teenager, far from a fighter. I remained in my room and stayed awake until my mum returned around 9 in the morning. It was such a long time to be scared for. When I told her what happened, she was angry at me for not calling 911. She was right. I should have called them. I was pretty shy as a kid, though, and it all felt so serious and grown up. I'm lucky I get to tell the story. I'm 26 years old and still live with my parents. It's a bit embarrassing, but house prices are so expensive and it's not worth renting because my parents' house is really nice. There's enough room to have my own space. Anyway, one afternoon in summer, they were out and I was doing some gardening in the front yard, pulling out some weeds, that kind of stuff. I was crouched down, pulling out the weeds, when I happened to glance up at one of the upstairs windows and saw a woman standing there. She was definitely not my mum. She was a complete stranger. I continued watching her for a moment or two, and when she noticed me looking, she quickly disappeared from view. Without thinking, I rushed inside, heading straight for the room on the upper floor where she'd been stood. To my bewilderment, she was nowhere to be found. I checked every room, including the bedrooms, the bathroom, and even the closets. Then I searched downstairs, checking the living room, kitchen, dining room, and other closets. Finally, I made my way to the basement, though I doubt anyone could hide there. It was a small space with a couple of couches, a bar, and 2 closets, leaving little room for someone to conceal themselves. But as I opened the second closet door, a chill ran down my spine. I hadn't a clue where else she could be hiding in the house. Taking a deep breath, I flung the door open, ready to confront her. Instead, I found only a collection of coats and coat hangers. Confusion tugged at me. I knew I hadn't imagined that woman. I had seen her clear as day. I returned to the ground floor and let out a loud scream, demanding that whoever was in the house get out immediately. My scream was so piercing that our next-door neighbor hurried over to check on me. I explained to him that I'd seen a woman at an upstairs window, and he agreed to help me search the house again. But once more, we came up empty-handed. We could only assume that she had slipped out through the back door. After my neighbor left, I secured all the doors, called my parents to relay the story, and proceeded to check that nothing had been stolen. Fortunately, everything seemed to be in its place. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The memory of the mysterious woman at the window was stuck in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, she was there. As I was finally beginning to drift off, I heard faint noises from the other side of the room. The fan above me created some ambient noise, so I didn't immediately react. But as the sounds grew more human-like, I turned over to my other side, and there she was, emerging from under my bed. I let out a scream that was even louder than the one earlier in the day. I jumped out of bed and tackled her to the floor, my hand gripping her throat as I demanded to know who she was. She didn't answer, and I kept on shouting and screaming at her. And then the doorbell rang again. My neighbor had returned. I pulled the disheveled woman up from the floor and dragged her with me to the front door as she clawed and struggled. I still have 2 scars on my right arm from her desperate attempts to escape my grip. I swung the front door open and my neighbor entered, assisting me in restraining the woman. I immediately dialed the police, and as we waited for them to arrive, the woman continued to scream and hurl threats at us. She looked and acted like a person deep in the throes of addiction. She had deep-sunk eyes, pale skin, and an alarmingly skinny body. When the police finally arrived, one of the officers recognized her. They had dealt with her multiple times before. It was oddly satisfying to watch her being led away in the back of the police car. Afterward, I expressed my deep gratitude to my neighbor for coming to my aid so promptly. That night, although my mind still raced with anxiety, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of satisfaction, even though I couldn't fully explain why. During the summer of my final year of high school, my parents unexpectedly received an invitation from their old friend, Charles. He was wealthy and had just retired early. He invited them for a week-long visit in his lavish estate in upstate New York. He said he'd pay for everything, flights and all, so they could hardly say no. We lived in a cozy cottage nestled in the heart of a quiet town on the outskirts of Cambridge in England. Our cottage was surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles, and the nearest neighbor was a good distance away. We had a sprawling backyard with an enchanting garden, a quaint fish pond, and a well-maintained in-ground swimming pool, which was perfect for summer days. It's not normal to have garden pools in the UK. It was my dad's present to himself when he got a bonus one year at work. It was a Friday evening when my parents left for their trip, leaving me with clear instructions and a well-stocked pantry. I decided to enjoy my newfound freedom and set up my telescope on the deck to stargaze late at night. I had a few glasses of my dad's whiskey too, which loosened me up. I've always been fascinated by space, and the night was clear and the Milky Way sprawled across the sky like a silvery river. As I gazed at the stars, I heard a faint rustling in the woods behind our house. I dismissed it as a typical woodland noise at first, but then became aware of a distant voice calling out, "Hey, over here." The voice was strangely melodic, but definitely human. I turned off my telescope's night vision setting and strained to listen. The voice called out again, more urgently, "Hey, over here, we need help." This time I realized it was not a child's voice, but a grown man's. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to go. I was alone after all, but at the same time, they said they needed help. I decided to investigate, thinking that maybe someone had gotten lost in the woods or needed assistance. Grabbing my dad's flashlight from beside the front door, I made my way toward the dense tree line. I'm not easily spooked, but this was pretty scary because it gets really dark in the countryside where there's trees. The voice continued to call, guiding me with, "Right in front of you, please come help us." As I entered the woods, I called out, "I'm coming, where are you?" The voice replied, "Right in front of you, I see you." My steps faltered and I began to feel an unease settling in. Why would someone be calling for help from the woods in the dead of night? And why were they so elusive? I stopped in my tracks, feeling vulnerable and exposed in the dimly lit woods. The voice fell silent and my instincts kicked in. This didn't feel right at all. I began to backtrack cautiously, keeping my eyes on the tree line, ready to bolt if necessary. The silence was worrying now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Reaching the safety of my deck, I locked the sliding glass patio door and turned off all the lights inside. I watched and waited, but there were no more calls for help. The night remained still except for the chirping of crickets and an owl. Just when I was beginning to think that it was over, I heard a splash followed by a sound of water. I rushed to the window. The voice taunted me with a sinister laugh and proclaimed, "I see you." Through the darkness, I could just make out the silhouette of a man hiding behind the pool. I felt a bolt of adrenaline fire through my body. I snapped the blind shut and shouted, "Get lost, the police are on their way." I kept repeating those words, hoping to deter him. His laughter grew fainter, and I assumed that meant he had retreated. I sat on the couch, trembling and scared, but eventually exhaustion from the ordeal began to take over. I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke to find the cottage bathed in sunlight. The incident from the previous night felt like a horrible dream. My head was a bit rough from the whiskey, though I think I was mainly just exhausted from the adrenaline. I learned a valuable lesson that night about the importance of caution and the need to trust my instincts when it came to strangers.